Welcome to the Deplore Economic Chat with me, Radical Liberation, and the Mad Mercenary. I'm coming from St. Louis, Missouri, United States, and Mad Merc is somewhere in Australia. I gather not in the middle of the desert part. Okay, first thing I wanted to mention really quick is that I just saw this. I haven't even had a chance to read it, but I know the author, and I wanted to pump up what they're doing over there at Mises.org. David Gordon, it doesn't say it on this page, but it says that this is the beginning of a series called Friday Philosophy, where David Gordon, here we go, is going to talk about philosophy. David Gordon, what do I say about him? Murray Rothbard said that he was like the smartest guy he ever met. Other people call him the walking encyclopedia. More importantly than that, I guess for our purposes, is that David Gordon is trained in philosophy, really knows economics very deeply, and many other things related to libertarian thought or Austro-libertarian thought. He is deeply knowledgeable in all these areas and way, way, way more beyond these areas. And he's kind of a friend of mine. I think of him as a friend. I've talked to him a lot over the years, visiting the Mises Institute. And he is just so smart. And so his big skill is analytical. He is able to take a bad argument apart and make it clear why it doesn't work. That is one of the areas where he's really the best. So in this article, for example, he's taking on the notion of paternalism. And I can see he addresses Cass Sunstein, for example, who's a big pusher of, the nudge, if you've heard about nudging people and things like that. So anyway, it's short and I recommend it to you. And I have the power to put this into, how do I do this? I have the power to put this in the chat, so I will. So there, please read that. Okay, secondly, Mad Mercenary, share us some numbers on the US versus China at a very high level.
Right, so these numbers, by the way, come from GNC Economics. So, if I can just grab the tab. So, nominal GDP of China currently sits at about $14 trillion USD. Total debt of China, this does not include unfunded liabilities or shadow banking, which we will get into, sits at about $31 trillion. GDP of the United States sits currently at $20.5 trillion. Total debt of the United States sits currently at $23 trillion.
So with an economy, let's say 3/4 of the size. Wait, did I get that right?
About half.
Oh, I'm sorry, I did something wrong. What's the GDP?
Of?
US.
$20.5 trillion.
And China GDP, I thought you said it was 14.
It is.
Okay, so yeah, so it's about 3/4, right?
Yep.
So China GDP is about 3/4 of US GDP, but their debt is what is that? Almost 50% more or something than the US debt. So they have a smaller economy and a much larger debt. So that is, I love that as a very high level way to get started. How'd we get here?
Well, a lot of debt and a lot of stimulus. That's essentially how it worked. The Chinese tried to fund their system through huge amounts of loans. They lowered we'll get into this a bit later, but they've lowered the standards of their loans back in 2016. The shadow banking system makes it pretty much that those standards have fallen away. And it's not just the major players within industry that are getting these loans. The loan system and the debt system is throughout China. So it's small, medium, large businesses and firms that are engaging in these practices. And in fact, some sources suggest that the smaller private businesses have taken even more debt than the larger businesses, because the larger businesses have the resources to understand that this is not going to end well.
I'm just seeing if one of the things we had, one of the graphs we had is maybe helpful. We've got that share of firms borrowing. Maybe that would be a good one to put up. Okay.
You can go for that if you like.
Let's see if I can hide that and share that. Okay, give me just a sec to do that. Okay, I'm sharing that now, right? Yeah. So, right. Wow. Well, it's actually looks worse. What is that? About 6-7 years ago, right?
Right. The thing is that debt hasn't gone away, and
right.
And so unfortunately, the share of firms borrowing, this is only the major players of industry in this graph.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so this is not showing the small and medium borrowing.
Exactly.
Right. This is the large firm borrowing. Okay.
So
go ahead.
So go ahead.
Go ahead, and then we have a great question. Go ahead first.
Sure. So what's been interesting about the third quarter of 2019 is that the major players and the majority of the economy, especially within the areas of manufacturing, construction especially, they've been seeing a downturn in profits and in returns. So that's been very interesting because the Chinese have been ramping this up, but they're starting to see that the returns and that the industries that they're trying to focus on are not growing anymore. So this could be the turning point. I don't want to suggest it is, but it could be a turning point to say, well, this is going to start to fall apart, because if they're not getting more profit and more revenue, even though they're pumping this debt into the system as much as they can, the ride may be coming to a stop.
Right. And I know that we watched a video that talked about this. I don't know that we have a handy graph, but I think we all grew up hearing about how China was growing at just these phenomenal rates, 8% every year. For comparison, say a 3% growth for the U.S. would be considered like a really good year. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So China had been at 8% just year after year after year, and then it went down to 7 and 6, but still just phenomenal growth, right? I think basically because they were starting from such a horrible place, there was nowhere to go but up, right?
Right.
But anyway. What we were learning from that video, which I should share, and I will, I'll put a link in the chat, is that that has now come down to now it's getting down to, mature economy levels, 1 to 3% kind of range. Am I getting that about right?
Well, Beijing is put in a bit of a position by this. So if they say we're going to slow the growth, then they have to face the debt bubble. And if investors don't, especially within the shadow banking system, don't get a return, then the whole system falls apart. So they're kind of addicted to these high numbers, or else it's a stack of cards. It's a house of cards, sorry.
Right.
And there's also the propaganda element to it. So you're saying, wow, we're growing at 8%. No one else has been able to do this strong, stable government. Then you start to slow the growth. Well, then there's doubts about your leadership. Well, how come the previous guy was able to do this and you're not? Right.
So there, what we see in this video, I just shared the link. I'll share it a little better. It's from a firm that gathers, an independent firm. That's the key. They're not they're not just repeating the numbers that the Chinese government tells. They're gathering their own information by being plugged into Chinese businesses and so on and so forth. And they gather that data and try to give a picture of what's really going on in the Chinese economy. Gathers data. Yeah, and he pointed out pretty much everybody else is just taking what the Chinese government reports and, presenting it, right? They're not doing their own data gathering. So you get a slightly different story when you get on the ground yourself, because the Chinese government wants to paint things a certain way. But anyway, one of the things that struck me in his comments is, I think what you're talking about, which is that they are afraid of an overheated economy, right? But they're also afraid
highly overheated.
Yeah, highly overheated. But the Chinese government is also afraid of being the ones where, like it crashes on their watch, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's the puzzle they have.
Well, the system of debt is so perverse throughout the system that I think a crash is inevitable. There has to be a correction to this because there's just too much debt in the system. And it's not helped by, so what we've seen, especially within government spending, is these, there's specialties. This is the big construction boom that everyone's been seeing. They're building roads to nowhere, they're building docks, they're building ships, they're building ghost cities. This is that big financial boom. This is this big release of debt and capital to try and stimulate the economy. And what we've been seeing, especially through shadow banking, which is offering smaller and larger business, small, medium, and large businesses of all kinds, loans through trusts and wealth management projects, which are funded by banks and owned by banks, but because they are only subsidiary of banks, don't fall under the rules and regulations of the banks. So they can actually offer out loans to anyone for any reason at any time. And in fact, there's been suggestions from that Beijing has ordered this to happen because the goal of a business there is not to actually generate employment, to not actually generate growth or be successful, but just to keep employment. There may be an alternate goal.
I put a graph up. Maybe you could just walk us through what that's showing us real quick.
Sure. So what we're seeing here is shadow banking and the percentage of it as loans. So you can see that banks are in the pink up the top, and non-banks are down below in the blue. Shadow banking makes up the majority of loans.
Right, the blue.
Yep, they make up the vast majority of loans.
Right. So you could get a deceptive picture by looking at the official banks, basically, about how much debt is really going on in the Chinese economy. In fact, it looks like you would get something like 2/5 to 1/5 of the picture, depending on the year. Closer to 1/5 of the actual debt that's going on. So it's just drenching in debt. Yeah, now that early number you mentioned, let me bring it up again, the China debt of 31 trillion. I think you emphasized that is not the whole story. So what's that 31 trillion leaving out?
Right, so that 31 trillion is probably leaving out a few unsavory things. So for example, just like in the US debt, it doesn't account for unfunded liabilities. And as we all know, unfunded liabilities are the vast majority of what the actual debt is. So for example, within the US economy, the national debt is 23 trillion, but unfunded liabilities could be anywhere between 150 and 200 trillion. So, and now you take this to a system in China where they have this many people and this culture, essentially, all the way down to a starting business of debt and promising, and the Chinese government subsidizing everything. Well, what are their unfunded liabilities? It boggles the mind. I wouldn't be surprised if it was in the quadrillions. Seriously.
Speaking of debt, Charlemagne actually has a really excellent question. How much of China's debt does the U.S. hold, and how much of the U.S. debt does China hold? Do you have any high-level things you can say about that?
Ultimately, I would say one does matter, one doesn't. So the U.S. currency is the world currency. Everyone uses the U.S. dollar to trade. It's essentially it. Chinese holding U.S. debt matters in the sense that they'll probably try to use that U.S. debt to bail their own system out, if it ever came to that. But that would be a direct sign of weakness, and it would be very risky for them to do.
Mm-hmm.
U.S. holding Chinese debt, that's a little bit more of a scary proposition, just in the sense that it can't bring the U.S. down, but it can bring a lot of firms down because they operate within China and they hold a little bit of that debt. So it could bring some major players down. It could bring into question, why do we have this debt? So I can't give you a specific answer as to how much debt is held.
Yeah, the numbers.
I didn't think that would come up, but
I mean, all I remember, and this was years ago, but Peter Schiff said, the Chinese send us goods and we send them dollars, or not dollars, debt, government debt.
Yeah.
Right. So his point being that it's not sustainable, and China was just holding a huge amounts of U.S. debt.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we have some other graphs there.
Yeah. How about I bring up a few other things? It seemed to work to just click on them, and then they show up. Let's see what else we have. I'm just going to go through each one that we haven't hit yet. So what is this telling us about?
Right. So we see the specific sectors under there. So this is the third quarter of 2019. This is after a further round of stimulus. We see in the areas of manufacturing, real estate, construction, and services industries that they have seen a drop in revenue overall. Which is worrying because, as everyone knows, manufacturing, real estate, and construction are some of the largest industries that China is known for.
Right. And then, the guy from China Beige Book, where this data was provided, he talked about commodities and retail going up and said that's sort of the opposite of the picture they've been trying to paint, right?
Yeah.
That we're heavy into manufacturing and stuff like that, and here they are with retail growing, which is consumer led, one might say, right?
Yep, exactly. So it's the independent sources, China Beige. There's a very good guy. His name is Chris Boulding, I believe his name is. Yes, Christopher Boulding, very good Chinese expert on the economy. He's also saying that these numbers that the Chinese government are producing do not add up with the independent data showing that other sectors of the economy, retail, commodities, those sorts of sectors where it's people-driven, essentially, are growing, whereas the manufacturing, real estate, services, that sort of stuff, they're declining even though there's a further round of stimulus. So if that's happening, then we know that these are not stable systems. These are not healthy systems.
Right. I'm going to just switch to profits by sector, which I think is telling a similar story. It's just the profits instead of the revenue.
Yep.
And it looks like more of a fall off on manufacturing in this view of things, right? And then there was one more picture we wanted to share. Yeah, so what's the significance of this one, Medmerk?
Yeah, so the Chinese bond market is essentially a proxy for trading capital between the four major banks within China. it's very highly unstable, highly reactive to even the minutest change in Beijing. So usually a firm will try and issue bonds in order to raise capital.
Mm-hmm.
They can use that capital for whatever they means they need. Banks have been issuing bonds, and they've been using that capital to loan it out to new businesses. So you can buy a share. So you can buy a bond, and that money that you use to buy the bond is then used by the banks or through shadow banking to issue loans to businesses and firms. And as you can see in 2018, 2019, that's skyrocketed.
Yeah, what's going on? I mean, that seems. I mean, we've only got about a 6-year window, so it'd help if we were seeing a bigger picture. But based on that 6-year window, this looks like it's just going up, up, up. What does it mean?
Well, they're issuing more debt. They're just trying to stimulate the economy through issuing loans and employing people. They're finding every sort of means to do it. They'll do it through bonds. They'll do it through direct debt. They'll do it through shadow banking. They'll do it through just turning a blind eye. This system is so perverse, full of debt. I don't know how it's still lasting. It has to crash. There's no rhyme or reason it shouldn't have crashed already.
Mm-hmm.
And if the third quarter of 2019 is an indicator of what's going to happen throughout the rest of 2020, we're looking at the decline of China as an economic force. And this is definitely not helped by stuff like their demography or particular sectors of their economy, which are the most over-leveraged. And just a hint to that, it's agriculture.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were going to say manufacturing. Why
Manufacturing is second.
Why is agriculture so over-leveraged?
Because they can't feed themselves as it stands. So they've pumped a lot of the most debt per person is in the inner sort of regions of China. Doesn't mean it's the absolute most debt. It just means the most debt per person is in the inner regions in China.
Mm-hmm.
And it's those sort of inner regions where it's not too hilly, like in the south and in the north, that gets the big loans for rice and pork and beef. And just on a side note, China's lost 25% of its pigs because of I think it's African swine flu that just.
Oh wow, they got hit hard.
They got hit very hard. They've lost between a third and 25% of their pork.
Yeah, so this is like the mad cow thing in the UK, right? Yeah,
exactly. So they've been hit very hard in the last year, and the loans and the money has just been flowing into that sector. And if this all pops, then they actually lose their agricultural sector.
Okay, I want to bring in a little theory here to discuss this from a theory point of view, because I don't want to assume that everybody who watches this is, steeped in Austrian cycle theory and stuff, right? So, I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but make sure we're bringing people along. So, Mises here, and I grabbed this straight out of an academic agent video. I'm just going to read it out real quick. Credit expansion cannot increase the supply of real goods. It merely brings about a rearrangement. It diverts capital investment. Oh, here we go. Wait a second. Come on. I wish I could tell it to not do that. It diverts capital investment away from the course prescribed by the state of economic wealth and market conditions. It causes production to pursue paths which it would not follow unless the economy were to acquire an increase in material goods. As a result, the upswing lacks a solid base. It is not a real prosperity. It is illusory prosperity. It did not develop from an increase in economic wealth. Rather, it arose because the credit expansion created the illusion of such an increase. Sooner or later, it must become apparent that this economic situation is built on sand. So what's the gist of what he's getting at here? He's saying that simply loaning, making up numbers, or making up money, so to speak, that don't reflect the real goods that are available in the economy, and handing it to people does not result in real growth. It's just rearranging things, right? It just, the Chinese central planners, Chinese central government, in its great and infinite wisdom, decides that the agricultural sector should just get a ton of loans. But all those loans don't represent savings from the other parts of the economy. So they don't actually represent something that could result in actually developing the agriculture, say. It just moves stuff over there from some other part of the economy, and it becomes kind of a giant shell game from that point of view. And what he's describing is the role of credit expansion in creating a boom that is an illusory boom, right? It looks like lots of stuff is happening because lots of loans are being made, and therefore companies are doing things and buildings are being built, right? But as I think probably almost everyone listening to this knows, right? The ghost buildings and the ghost towns in China, that is, they were able to direct resources through playing around with credit and debt and so forth. They were able to direct resources towards building things, but the buildings were not what the market wanted. And so the buildings some of them are literally just empty. Do you know much about, I forget if we've talked about this before already on this series, but do you know a little bit about the empty buildings and the ghost towns or ghost cities or whatever?
I know a little bit. It is essentially just projects for major firms and to stimulate the economy. It's not adding anything. It's the equivalent of digging a hole. Okay, you've dug a hole. The council's paid you to dig a hole.
Yeah.
But you haven't actually created or added anything. The problem is that with these ghost cities, they're not just doing it in China. They're doing this across the world. So you'll see
famously they're all over Africa right now, right?
Yep, there are a lot of roads in Africa, and these roads are not high quality.
Mm-hmm.
The roads, I mean, it's better than what the Africans had, but they're not high quality. The signs are in Chinese because there's no incentive to actually do well. Seriously, the signs are in Chinese. When I was there were shit tons of, excuse the language, there were tons of Chinese writing signs and Chinese mopeds everywhere.
Oh, well, let me just slip in real quick. Charlemagne mentions that in fascist Italy under Mussolini, they also built entire ghost towns. So that's interesting.
Well, they have a similar economic model, just high debt, getting everyone. As long as you're doing something, you must be productive, right? Good work, China.
Right, and this is a theme we saw from John Maynard Keynes as well, right? He basically said it doesn't matter. Just it doesn't matter if you dig a hole and fill it in. Just hire people, get things going, right? Right.
It is completely fallacious because unless you're adding value to the marketplace, you're not doing anything. It's almost like a labor theory of value in a sense that, okay, I've done something, I'm active, I'm putting my labor into something, it has value, right? No, value is subjective.
Right.
You haven't added anything.
Yep. Okay, well, we are going to try to cover two topics, so I want to work towards making any final points we wanted to make, catch things from the chat. One comment that caught my eye, I'm going to say this gentleman's last name wrong, but NVIDIA says, I can hear the Peter Zehan. Do you know how to say it?
Yeah, Zahan.
Zahan. Okay, I can hear the Peter Zahan in this stream. Zahan is a good geopolitics guy. Thanks to Mad Merc for getting me onto him. I agree. I've watched a little bit myself, and he is the kind of person that is going to see what's happening in China and talk about the wider impacts of what's happening there, right?
Right. And just so people know, I for the record, I didn't suggest this topic because I'm a geopol wonk. Radlib wanted to talk about this topic. I'm not taking this stream over with geopolitics. Just so it's very clear, right?
Right. Well,
I know I'm going to be accused of that. So
sure. There's a couple reasons I wanted to bring it up. Number one, I have personal connections. I've traveled to China. I have colleagues in China. I have friends that are from China or in China. And I read the book China's Bloody Century by R.J. Rummel, who's the one of the important figures in my field of studying about mass murder. And so that made me, shall we say, wish that China could get a break, you know? And so in so many ways, except for the one-child policy, I've been happy with what I've been seeing in China since Deng Xiaoping was first in charge in 1978, something like that. So except for all the abortion, which I think is wrong, it seemed like China was essentially turning away from communism in a number of ways and allowing business and private ownership of the means of production to flourish and seeing the benefits from it. And that's true, right? I mean, we can't say that everything since 1978 is just an illusion. I mean, you wouldn't make any claim like that, right?
No. Obviously, it's real. Yeah.
I mean, it is at a different place than it was. I don't think it's going to be back to 1960 or, you know what I mean? It's not going to just fall back to there. I mean, it could in a total, Mad Max post-apocalyptic scenario, right? But we wouldn't really expect that. But we might expect that the success that it looks like China is having, there's going to be a reality check. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, right? And the video I shared from the Beige Book guy, he said they can do it the hard way or the easy way, right? The hard way is that they don't make any adjustments for reality, and it hits them very, very hard, and they have a real, a real horrible depression, and eventually, hopefully, just stabilize at sort of a sane amount of growth that's realistic and not debt funded. Or they could go the easy way, recognize that, hey, reality's coming and we better try everything we can to ease our way into it, ease off on on the loans. And do you remember any more what his recommendations were, how China could have a softer landing?
They can slowly recall the amount of debt and they can try to limit, especially within shadow banking, because that's the amount of loans, that the vast majority now of loans that are going out. They can try and limit that, the amount of capital that's going towards that. They can try, and this is really going to have to be a cultural change at the end of the day. If the Chinese are trying to do this, it has to be a cultural change. There is a culture within China of debt, of being okay with debt. And having the thing now. It's very high time preference. They have to change that if they want to get into a good footing.
Right.
Now,
I was going to say, you said it in so many words, but I was thinking debt and consumption, because that's also what I'm hearing from my Chinese friends. They say they go back to China, the ones who are working with me here in the US, they go back to China after just, several years, and the changes are so dramatic. And people have these expensive cars, and they're buying all these expensive foreign goods. It's like they've been broke all these years, right? And now suddenly they're just like going crazy. It's not a calm, measured move towards a more mature economy. It's just kind of we're gonna be rich right now, and we're gonna act like it, like nouveau riche, not old money. We're gonna act like nouveau riche right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's glance over the chat. Let's see if you had anything, any other points you wanted to make sure before we transition to our other topic. So go ahead.
I have one more.
Yeah.
I have one more graph, and I have no idea how to bring it up.
Yeah, I think
Screen share is not working.
I think easiest is to, it might be because
I'll
I'm
make it.
sharing already. Here, in fact, how about remove from stream? Try it one more time with me, and I'll stop my sharing. See if you can share now. I don't know if I have to like permission you or something.
No, it's not working. How about this? I'll change my avatar real quick to the picture.
Oh, good idea.
Okay.
It'll be a little bit small that way because it won't, you know.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's all
actually, can I play with it?
There we go. All right. Picture. Upload image. Sorry, folks.
Or you could just message it to me really quick. Or, you know, on Discord or whatever, and I'll have it up in just a moment.
You know what? I'll message it to you through Twitter.
Okay. I'll get it there. And then once you do that, actually, while I'm messing with that, would you scroll back through the stream a little and see if there's any points on the China topic that we want to address?
Sure. Alrighty, folks. Lay out your questions. Let's go.
But also scroll up. People have been making comments. I picked out a couple, but I think I've missed some as well, if you would.
With links. Fascist Italy, we did that.
Yeah. You did send that through Twitter, right? I'm not seeing it for some reason.
Not seeing it.
Through our DMs, right?
Yep. Sent it now.
Okay. I'm seeing it come through now. Thanks.
Yep,
yeah, so what else?
Yeah, guys. Questions? I'll try to answer them. There's a lot of very wealthy / well-off Chinese uni students in London. Their consuming behavior is often that of someone making up for lost time. Yeah, and that's the cultural element in China I was talking about. There's just a high time preference cultural ingrained into China, just because of how much debt and consumption is in the system. I don't know how else to put it. You got that image?
Yeah, just taking me a sec to pull it up, and hopefully.
I think this should put it in perspective for everyone, because we're talking about a lot of high numbers here, and I know we put it at the start of the show, $31 trillion of known debt, but I think this graph really puts it in perspective.
Okay, here we go, and I wonder if I'll even give it the whole screen so people can see it better. Okay, yeah. So walk us through this. What's the color for China? It's the line that goes up to the dock.
All the way.
It goes up to the dock, the StreamYard dock.
Yep. And by the way, this is only 2017 numbers, people. This is the one I could find on short notice, but there is one for 2019, and that line goes even more vertically up after 2017.
So what does a capital shortage mean? I don't know that term.
Right. So this is essentially a capital shortage for the amount of capital running through the system. It's a complicated term, but that's essentially what it means. So the amount of capital running through the system. It's just through loans, debt, industries, all sorts of stuff.
Why do they call it a shortage? It sounds like it's the opposite of a shortage. Okay, anyway, so ignore that term. The point is,
I think the idea is that it's a shortage, like you're short of, like you're constantly giving it out. You're short of that capital for yourself.
Okay, so the point is that this is a country-to-country comparison.
Right. So you see the blue line down the bottom, very flat, just a little bit of a hump for 2008. That's the United States. That's $800 billion worth of stimulus under the Obama presidency. That was too much, too fast for an economy of $20 trillion. Obviously not 20 trillion at the time, but too much, too fast.
Yeah, and you can barely see that 2008 move in this picture here.
Yep.
Right.
This is the euro is just above that. Much worse, obviously. So, but they're coming back down. Greece, dotted line, they're horrid.
Well. Yeah.
Yep. Brazil, they're on a similar path to Greece. Since they had probably their big spike 2009, 2010.
Mm-hmm.
Bolsonaro, I hopefully will fix this, but
he's got the right people in his administration to tell him to calm it down.
He does. This is what happens when you let socialists run your country.
Right.
You get a big spike.
Yep.
Next we have India, Turkey, authoritarian regimes. The both of them. They're highly into debt, government spending. India's in a similar position to China. Just lots of debt running through the system. Not to the same extent, but similar position. And then you have China.
Right.
And China has borrowed more than all of them.
So this is not a super recent phenomenon. It looks like about 2012, 2013, China pulls away from India and just skyrockets above everybody. So that's 6 years ago.
Yep.
So yeah, debt, and the illusory prosperity that Mises was referring to. Okay, so one more comment I see from Charlemagne that sounds very interesting to me. I recommend reading 3 New Deals, which is a short book on public projects such as Ghost Cities in National Socialist Germany, Fascist Italy, and Progressive America. I'm always happy when FDR is linked to Mussolini and Hitler because I hate FDR and everything he stood for and everything he did, except for the end of Prohibition, which is the only reason anyone liked him. Really, people forget that. They think they liked him because of the New Deal. No, it's because they were able to drink alcohol again legally. That's why they liked him. The New Deal never worked. It never. It just, the country stayed in a depression the whole time.
It's stagnation. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, unless you have any other hot things on China, why don't we switch to our next topic?
Alrighty.
Okay. So here we're going in really cold, for me at least, on post-scarcity. So can you give us a quick intro to what in the heck is meant by, I think usually the phrase would be the post-scarcity economy, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what are they trying to say?
If we ever get to a world of post-scarcity, meaning that there's no scarce resources, so we have plenty of air, plenty of steel, plenty of time, plenty of cotton, colors, everything. No, there's nothing of scarcity. We don't need prices. We can just give it out for free. How does that work? How does that sort of world work? If we ever reach a time where technology is so good that we don't need to worry about scarcity and price mechanisms in order to value that scarcity.
So are we analyzing this as a prediction, or it's just sort of a theoretical plaything? I mean, is anyone saying that we are entering a post-scarcity era?
Well, I would like to challenge the very idea of post-scarcity. I don't think it would ever happen.
Yeah, no, I agree.
See, post-scarcity, you always have scarce resources. You know, you can't spend your time everywhere. That's a scarce resource. You're not going to live forever. Sorry, people. That's a scarce resource.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be something that's valued and that's limited. I just don't see it coming about if we're going to go from that angle.
And so why is this, okay, I do want to talk more about that, but why is this a thing? Like, why are people talking about this?
I believe it was Charlemagne who actually brought this up in the Deep Lore, and I thought, well, post-scarcity, it sounds like an interesting topic. I think it holds some economic grounds that we can discuss. So what actually makes something scarce, what gives something value, and why post-scarcity really can't work. Because there's always something that's scarce.
Right. So Charlemagne's giving us some help here. He says, some progressives believe that we will reach a point of technology that is close enough to Star Trek that there will be no need to work, essentially. That's interesting to me, because I don't exactly know where those progressives are coming from, but it does sort of echo what you see in some of the Marxist, social. Well, I don't know about Marx himself, but socialist literature. Certainly the pre-Marxists and maybe the Marxists, Marx and the Marxists as well. But they talk about this crazy stuff about how in this socialist future, the seas will be made of lemonade, and it's pretty weird stuff. But what you see again and again is, look, it's just capitalism that's holding us back. If we didn't have this horrible system of capitalism and we did things in the socialist way, then magic would happen. I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. But basically, we would eliminate scarcity effectively, things like that. And I wish I understood a little more why they think that would happen. I think you and I can do a good job of explaining. Thank you. Rogers says Charles Fourier was the riding on the back of lions through a sea of lemonade or whatever the heck.
Yeah, that's
pre-Marx socialism. I think you and I can do a pretty good job of explaining how we think about scarcity from an economic point of view and why we wouldn't see it as going away this side of, reality, right?
Yeah.
In this dimension. But I have trouble understanding, like, why is this a thing? Like, why do people think about it? Why do people push it? Like what's their angle? What's their damage?
I can only speculate as to why they would want this, but I think the idea, they want utopia. They want the world that's perfect.
Right.
It can never, obviously that's, utopia is not of this world, people. I think they want the suffering to stop. It comes from a place of compassion and empathy, and they want everyone to be well off. Unfortunately, that's not reality. That's just not how this world works. It's not how it's ever going to work. There's always someone who's going to be hurting, and
right. So
not going to be in a good position.
What this is making me think of is like the attacks on the millionaires and the billionaires, and the sort of the underlying idea. And maybe I'm being unfair, but the underlying thing I think I hear from like the Corbyns and the Bernie Sanders and people like this, Jeremy Corbyns and Bernie Sanders, is, look, all we have to do is redistribute all this stuff that is unfairly, in the hands of a few people, and then basically we'll all be rich, One of the quick checks you can do on that is take all the money, the figures for the millionaires and billionaires, and divide that dollar amount, add it up, the net worth of Bill Gates and blah, 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 right? Add it up and divide it by the population. And it's a sobering bit of math to do, because suddenly you're like, oh, well, I guess it'd be nice to get $1,000, but it wouldn't change my life,
Yeah, exactly. And you'd be destroying the entire industry and
right.
depriving someone. It's jealousy and envy in the form of compassion. It's under the sheep's clothes of compassion, essentially what I think this is. And it just comes back to the Luddite question, right? Oh, these machines will take our jobs. It's just the other way around. Well, these machines can have all our jobs and do everything for us. Well, you're gonna want to do something with your life. People can't just be leisure 24/7. We get bored. It's just a fact. We get bored. We find meaninglessness unless we're doing something. So we're always going to be industrious, and there's always going to be people who are better at some things than other people, and machines can't do everything for you. It's a fact. You can't live in some sort of utopia where you don't have to do anything, you get everything for free because the robot's doing everything.
We've got some more people helping us out here. Lumberg says the idea is that tech or AI does it all. Dilvany, the goddess, says, I think the reasoning is that people have finite needs. Capitalism forces consumption, and technology can end the need for constant work. I think this is their logic. So first of all, on the tech, this is a particular topic I've thought about a lot because I happen to work in the technology sector. And so I think it's pretty neat personally, but I also don't see it as magic, right? I mean, it's almost magical, right? I mean, the iPhone in your pocket with the whole internet in your pocket relative to what, 15 years ago or whatever. It's not been that long. It's a magical transformation, and it is changing a lot of things, right? But it isn't abolishing scarcity, right? It's not that magic.
If anything, it can create more scarcity. It can create more things that people value. So, for example, before the iPhone, there is no app store.
Right. Yeah.
There is no need for unlimited data. There is no need for 4G on your phone. All right, these things come about through technological innovation. So the idea that, well, we'll invent this one technology and all of it's solved. Well, it's kind of like Pandora's box. You just keep opening, and you get new things that come out, and you got to deal with them.
Yep. And then speaking to the point Dilvany brought up, people have finite needs. Capitalism forces consumption. I think I have heard this. I think this sounds like a familiar point, right? I think it's sometimes under the name of consumerism. It's the idea that we're sort of being artificially pushed to consume. Now, first of all, there is some truth to this. I think Academic Agent has been talking about this recently in some of his stuff, that there is this Keynesian view that we've got to keep the economy growing. We've got to keep people consuming. We've got to, like what we just talked about with China, right? We've got to make lots of loans. We've got to heat this thing up, right? And that's not the free market view. The free market view is just let people's property be respected and let people make exchanges if they want to. But there's no apply the lash until people consume and trade with each other, right? Or, anyone who doesn't start a business shall be punished. That's not the free market view. It just so happens, as economists have pointed out, that when you respect property rights and when you allow people to form businesses and don't put obstacles in their way and don't have corruption that makes it hard to form a business and bureaucracy and all that, then people are creative and they look for ways to meet each other's needs and they make a profit doing it, right? So it just is something that naturally happens and is unleashed. It doesn't have to be shoved down people's throats. But that's a healthy natural growth and not this debt-driven growth that we were talking about in China, for example. But really, let's be fair. China is particularly scary, as we saw from those graphs, but all of the developed economies have at least a touch of this going on, right? If not quite a bit. Yep. Yeah. So it's not like China's the only one playing this game by any means.
No. I think there's a bit of a good point that I think we're touching around a point in the chat there that there's materialism and whether the free market and the endless need for stuff is a good thing. And is it good for man? I think that's more of a philosophical question, guys.
Right.
But we are better off today than what we were 1,000 years ago, and that's just a simple fact. And whether it's good for us as humans, well, materialistically, yes. There's I don't know how to phrase this very well. I'll try my best. But if you have to choose between living here or then, you choose to live here.
Right.
And I don't think post-scarcity really has much to do with that. You're going to consume no matter what. It's just a fact of life. You're going to consume. You're going to want new stuff. You're going to want to grow and to make something new, better, faster, stronger.
Right.
And post-scarcity doesn't change that.
Right. So let's directly address what we mean by scarcity in economics, and therefore why we have trouble imagining it going away. Right. So what is okay? Well, let's see. I go back to Carl Munger and his definition of an economic good. And he has various attributes. He does a sort of Aristotelian analysis of what are the properties that make something into an economic good. And he says things like it's accessible, there might be diamonds in another galaxy, but that's not an economic good for us because we can't get to those diamonds, at least not now. If we could get to them someday, then they might become an economic good. So goods need to be accessible. They need to be, they need to have a way for us to use them or value them in some way. If we don't know that something is useful to us, like oil at one time was just viewed as an irritant. You found oil on your land and you're like, oh, what a bummer. Now I can't grow crops here because it's all this oil won't let me grow food, And eventually people realized, oh, wait a second, this oil is useful. And suddenly it became an economic good, right? So anyway, so that economic good analysis, one of the other things is that it has to be scarce. Well, what do we mean? We mean that in most contexts, for most of us, most of the time, breathable air is not an economic good. We aren't buying bottled air the way we buy, say, bottled water, right? We just breathe the air that's all around us, and we're not buying and selling it. So it's not an economic good. It's effectively not scarce. So what would post-scarcity mean? It would mean that most of the things, or all the things, I don't know what their picture is, but so many things that we think of as that are economic goods now would cease being economic goods. They'd become like air. And that is indeed that Star Trek future, right? Where food is like air. There's no reason to pay anyone for food. It just falls into your lap, comes out of your, goodness, I guess I haven't watched Star Trek in a while. What's the thing that makes the stuff? You press the button.
I don't know. I don't watch Star Trek.
Oh, anyway, they would press buttons and then just food appears, it just gets materialized somehow, that's what they mean by the Star Trek future. So, we press a button and the food is just there and we don't really have to pay for food. We press a button and a house appears and we don't have to pay anyone to build the house, right? So on and so forth. So that these things become like air. No one buys or sells them. You just use them. They're super abundant to the point that they're no longer an economic good. You can almost, I want to try to be as sympathetic as I can here. You can almost see where people are coming from because the effects of the developing economy over the last several hundred years have been so dramatic, right? Academic Agent likes to talk about the price of bread in terms of a person's labor, or the price of light in your house in terms of labor, right? And you go back 100, 200 years, and it takes you like all day to buy the bread for your family, right? For the week. And now it takes you like 5 minutes or 1 minute or 30 seconds of your labor. It buys you all the bread you need, right? So it almost sounds like, well, look at that graph. It'll just hit zero, right? Eventually you won't have to do anything and you'll just have bread. Well, the economic growth is very dramatic, but I don't know that it's going to get us quite there.
Yeah, anyone who does like maths and graphs, they'll know that if you have an exponential line, if you run along the x-axis, it actually never meets the x-axis. I see that kind of like with this sort of idea. You can get that price all the way down to like a few cents, but there's always going to be some sort of value to it. You can't just sell it for nothing, because then it's post-scarcity.
Right. So I guess the other way to be sympathetic to this point of view is to say, okay, I'm trying to imagine someone who actually understands economics, but is also a post-scarcity person. Okay, sure, it's never going to hit zero. But look, if we could just be satisfied with what our ancestors would have been perfectly happy with, a little hovel and some bread and cheese, then, okay, well, maybe we wouldn't need to work at all. But we could work for, 5 minutes a week or an hour a week or something and have our very modest space and kind of live like monks, And it's only because of capitalism and consumerism that we want to have I think about this because I have 8 children, right? We generally want to have a bedroom for each of our children, or maybe a bedroom for each child or 2, but we don't want to have like 4 or 5 children in one bedroom, like they would have. Our grandparents or great grandparents probably grew up exactly like that, right? But we've grown to consider that unacceptable at this point. We think a child should maybe share a room with one sibling, and that's about as much. And so we need to have a house big enough so that mom and dad have a bedroom, each child has a bedroom, there's an office, so on and so forth. In the old days, the homes weren't like that, right? So all we need to do is sort of reduce our desire to consume, and we would be maybe not in a complete post-scarcity world, but really, really close to it. So what's your response to that picture?
It's not realistic.
Why not?
People always want to consume more, get the better thing, and you're disincentivizing growth in that sort of area. So if everyone suddenly decided to say, I want a 1-bedroom house, we can all sleep together, it's fine. And we can all sleep in the same room, 1 bed, that's fine. Well, you're limiting, if you put that as the standard, you're limiting as to what's possible in the future. If there's only a demand for one thing, then you've limited necessarily the possibility for advancement and industriousness for other strains of thought that could be opened if you just developed normally. I mean, who would have thought 100 years ago you could have a glass and metal square in your hand that can control the beams of light that come from your roof? That's a remote.
Mm-hmm.
No one would have thought that 100 years ago, but because we have that constant need for more, that constant need for innovation, that constant need for that better, bigger, better, harder, stronger, faster product, we get the best.
So more comments along these lines. Volpez says, proto-paleo-neo-Ludditism is the only way. Revolt against the industrial world. And then Charlemagne says, this is similar to what I was painting, but let's address his question directly. What if scarcity is limited to food and housing? Food and housing is so abundant that you can have decent food and housing provided for you automatically by technology. Good enough such that some people would choose never to work and try to get never to work and get more and just be artists or whatever. Can this ever be realistically economically achieved? I don't know that we're even seeing that even in the United States.
Well, space is still scarcity.
Yeah. So what I see is, if you want to live in the city, then the property values are high, right?
Yep.
But there's lots of work. If you want to go where the property values are low, out in the wilderness or something, you can probably get housing for a very small amount of money relative to living in the city, right? The further you go away from the city, usually, you can get some pretty low property values. Out in the desert of Australia, the middle of Australia or whatever, right? But there's no work.
They're actually pretty expensive because they build the houses underground.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Bad example. I'm thinking of a temperate. I'm thinking of a temperate wilderness. Anyway, but you choose that option where property values are low, and now getting basic supplies becomes a challenge. Getting a job to support whatever even though your needs might be small, you probably need to, in a realistic scenario, you need to provide for them somehow. You need to work somehow. And it's harder to find work, as we know, away from the cities. And more people all over the world are moving to the cities or close by them because that's where the work is, right? So anyway, that's some of my thoughts as he talks about, the starving artist scenario, or the not starving artist, the artist that's got enough to live on scenario, right?
Well, all I would say is that if the artist is bringing value enough that he can live on it, good for him.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I don't see that as much of a problem. And if housing is down to the point where you can subsist yourself on minimal pay, well, that's fantastic. Doesn't mean that the pay isn't there.
Right. Yes.
You haven't eliminated the actual scarcity. The scarcity is lower. Obviously, there's more housing. We've found a way to increase our productivity in that sense, but that doesn't mean the scarcity's gone away.
Okay, and then Rogers brings up the point that I wanted to make sure we got to, which is a point that you'll find in the Austrian literature, for example. Time will forever be scarce. So even if, as we've been discussing, material goods become cheaper and cheaper such that maybe they're not scarce. Oh, sorry. Moving away from the mic. Maybe that they're not scarce, but that they, I'm sorry, maybe that they're not super abundant, but they're so cheap as to be very close, right? Still, you would have time. So Rogers says post-scarcity and time is metaphysically impossible, in my opinion. Time is a factor in valuation, time preference. Thus, material goods will still be economic goods. So here's something I see, and that is that, and you might know the statistics on this better, Matt Merck, but what I see as an economy develops is that services become a larger part of the economy. By which I mean, I'm really referring to Julian Simon's great point in the ultimate human resource, the ultimate resource, which is that the ultimate resource is humans. That everything gets cheaper in the long run, except for one thing, and that's people time. And so what you see in a developing economy is that, sure, it's cheaper and cheaper to light your house and to have bread. But man, you can't have a servant anymore. Like in the good old days of my grandparents, who literally had a servant, a maid, you can't afford a maid anymore. That becomes something that only the pretty rich have. And, middle-class people don't have maids or servants or anything like that. At one time, that was fairly standard, and now it's not. Well, that's, in my view, only going to get worse. So while material goods are becoming less scarce in the sense of cheaper, that is true that is a long-run tendency, I think, that we're seeing. It is people time, services that becomes more expensive. And it seems to me that that's something that people come to value more and more in a way, right? So, for example, a lot of people, you think about like a site like Etsy, a lot of people really value handmade goods at this point because everything is made in a factory, right? So to have something with a bit of a personal touch becomes really valuable to people. And I'm thinking of other sort of personal services. Anyway, so that's something I see coming, is that the time that you want to get from other people to do things for you in one fashion or another, that becomes the thing that's really hard to come by and really expensive. I use the advantage of maids, right? But there's all kinds of other things that, when it comes down to it, involve asking someone else to spend their time doing something for you, right? And that's the thing that's going to become the opposite of post-scarce. It's going to become worse, harder, more and more expensive.
Yeah. Well, I would. So I'll take it from a technical angle first, and then I'll break it down to a more personal level for everyone. So the economy at the moment, we used to be like 90% agriculture. Then we went to majority manufacturing. Mm-hmm. We're in the economic shift at the moment of where the economy is mostly services, mainly financial services. So that human element and services making up more of a majority, more part of the economy now. I think you're very right on that. The human element, humans providing something is going to be much more important, because we're on our way, and we've kind of sort of mastered the material sort of side. Everyone can live till 80. Everyone
Mhm.
can have a bread for $2 down at the local
Right.
RGA. But we can have we'll value the more personal, the human interaction more because of how materialistic we've become. I mean, community, several generations of people are no longer involved in the raising and rearing of children.
Right.
We don't get together as communities anymore. We don't go to church anymore. And I think we've definitely lost that sort of interpersonal relationship. And I think,
Mhm.
I don't want to become economically focused here, but when you lose something, it becomes more valuable to you.
Yep.
When you're thirsty and you don't have a glass of water, that glass of water is very, very valuable to you. When you've lost that personal interaction, when you've lost that sense of community and people loving and actually interacting with each other, it becomes more valued. Services, in that sort of sense, become more valued. So you can never really get rid of scarcity in that sort of sense. There's
I
always going to be something that someone needs and wants.
I do want to
And
head towards
we just have
wrapping
to
it up.
recognize that and live with it.
I do want to head towards wrapping up because we're over an hour now, but I think we need to bring in the artificial intelligence, which was mentioned briefly before, because that would be maybe the response. No, we're going to lose all our jobs to artificial intelligence, which doesn't necessarily mean like a robot, right? But just, an algorithm can do the job that, so say a white collar person is doing today. And we can just have a computer algorithm handling that. I am very skeptical of these sorts of things. It's a little complicated to explain, but I would point you to Hayek's work that we don't talk about as much in these circles. In addition to economics, probably one of his most interesting contributions was a model of the brain, the Hayek-Hobbs synapse model of the brain, which ended up being right. It is how our brain works. And if you read Hayek and his work on this, and I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the title of the book that I have in mind here. He wrote it after World War II, I think. You start to see the limits of computers replacing what the mind does. And so I am very impressed in some ways by the things that computer algorithms can do. I mean, I'm a software programmer, so I'm very aware of the advances in this area. And there are certain things that essentially involve a lot of repetitive, what am I trying to say here? Brute force. There's a lot of things you can brute force with computers. Like you can get a computer to play chess, right? It took a while, but eventually the chess algorithms started beating the human chess players. And they did it by brute force, I think. Though maybe they eventually got to neural networks. I don't know. Last I knew, it was just brute force. They just consider every possible, play out every possible scenario of making a certain move and then pick the best move, So you can do that sort of thing, but it really does have its limits. It's pretty niche ultimately, and there are just so many things that rely on human judgment, the ability of human minds to recognize patterns, to do something novel. In fact, I think a lot of what most people who are knowledge workers, the fancy name for white collar workers now, a lot of people who are knowledge workers like me, it involves doing something that no one's done exactly before. There's an element of creativity. And I just don't think we're going to have artificial intelligence creativity.
Yep.
Not in anything but a way that a sense that's really just sort of a magic trick. It's not really going to be creativity. It might sort of look like it, but it's not going to be creativity in the sense we mean it. Go ahead.
So a robot can make the paintings of Picasso one for one and can create paintings in his style. But that robot didn't invent Picasso's style.
Right.
It's an imitation, but it is not the creation.
Right.
And creativity necessarily means having you're not programmed. You're not. What's the word? You're not on this linear sort of track like a machine is. You have to actually be inventive and creative and have that sort of built into you. But maybe one day we will see a computer that can create something for us. It can create a new type of style of music, for example. But until that day comes, we hold a monopoly on that as people, and
Right.
I don't see that going away anytime soon. Perhaps 1,000 years from now.
I was going to say, didn't they already do that with techno? I thought I had one more point to make on AI. Just to say that, again, putting on my other hat as the way I make money is in software and everything. So I was in university studying computer science in the late 80s. And I remember one of my professors showing me the cool stuff he was doing with handwriting recognition and stuff like that, And I think there was more of a sense then, as I recall, of like, wow, the sky's the limit, with artificial intelligence. My sense from being inside the field a bit of computer science is that, and software, is that those early visions for where AI could go have calmed down quite a bit. And now it's like, well, there's certain things we think we can do with computers, and there's other things we can't. And the idea that basically everything humans do, we can teach a computer to do. I don't think in the actual profession, the people actually doing this work, I don't think they really believe that. I think this is sort of a scientism thing. It's people who are not the specialists in the field and are just sort of impressed with some of the advances. They're the ones who are imagining it going in a direction that it ultimately, I don't think, can go.
Yeah. So there's a key term I think we need to introduce into this conversation. It's machine learning.
Right.
It is not machine creation. It's machine learning. Machines can only learn what we tell them to learn.
Right.
They can't invent something new. And I think the people who want to try and have this whole reality where machines do everything for us because they think for themselves don't quite understand the limitations of the actual technology.
Right. Here's how I view it as a technology professional. If we can figure how to make something into a routine, like step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this, and it's pretty much just apply that routine every time, we can probably have a computer take that job over, right? And we do. And we see that all around us, right? As we apply that to more and more areas of our life. But not everything we do can be turned into a routine. And in fact, over time, we find that that's what more and more people, especially in advanced economies, are focused on. It's the stuff that you can't just turn into a simple routine. If you can, or build a machine to do it, to be stronger than you, say, like a heavy construction equipment. If you can do that, then you do it, but you're not done. That just eliminated sort of the boring work. And what it leaves for us is the stuff that humans are good at, the creative aspect. And as somebody said, the part that involves empathy, which is related to being entrepreneurial. That was a point from Rogers again. Thank you, Rogers. You've been very helpful today.
Someone still needs to design the house.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay, and then one more comment on this, and then I do want to wrap it up. Charlemagne says, it's not entirely true that computers can only learn things that we teach them. AI algorithms can produce emergent behavior that isn't explicitly programmed. So yeah, I know, but I still don't think we're going to just do drop-in replacements for people with machines, ever. I don't think it's possible. It's fun to imagine. I mean, I grew up reading the robot novels by Isaac Asimov and stuff like that. And it's fun to imagine, and Blade Runner, right? The original Blade Runner. Imagine that robots get to the point that they're essentially have achieved consciousness, right? or who is it? Somebody goes on about the singularity when the machines achieve consciousness, right?
Right. Well, how
yeah.
quickly do you think people are going to mess with these machines? I mean, does anyone else remember Tay, the Twitter account that Microsoft set up, and how quickly the internet made her into a anime-loving Nazi? I mean, if people don't think we're going to mess with these robots and actually push them to their limits of their software and their capabilities, then they haven't really been living in reality for the last 10 years.
Right.
And I think under that sort of strain, they still haven't figured out how to make the machines cope with it.
Okay, real quick, I want to move towards wrapping this up, and because we kind of screwed up our scheduling discussion, so I just want to live on air real quick. Let's see. I would like to do the same time. Are you going to go off daylight savings time?
No.
Okay. Really? Australia just stays on it forever?
So every state but Queensland does daylight savings.
But not all year round.
No, not all year round.
Oh, but it's the other part of the year than us. Okay, got it. So you're on daylight savings time for some months to come. Got it. Okay. So
no, I'm not.
Oh, you aren't?
No, Queensland is the only state that doesn't have daylight savings.
Oh. Okay. I'm sorry. What city am I supposed to use to
Brisbane.
Coordinate? Brisbane. I screwed that up. So
It's all right.
So I said we would be starting at, just quick calendar and day thing. Sydney time, I said we'd be starting at 8 a.m., but for you, that's actually 7 a.m.?
Yes.
Ugh. Wow. Is it okay for us to do that? It's a better time.
No, it's fine.
Okay,
it's
okay.
All right.
So what we're looking at is 7 a.m. on December 6th. So 2 weeks, 7 a.m. your time, but December 6th at basically the same time, 2 weeks from today, is when we will do this again. And we take topic suggestions through Twitter or through one of the many academic agent connected Discords.
Yes.
Or one of the many Discords that academic agent denies any connection with. Is the better way to put it. All right. So thanks, Mad Merc, once again. Any last things?
Yes. Remember, guys, on the 25th, it's Pinochet's, I think it's his birthday or date of death. So keep that day free and make sure you remember him. All right.
Let's make it a little right wing. Oh yeah, and I just got to share the thing. I think I shared it privately, but the distributist had written that starting a family, I guess he means he's having kids or whatever. Starting a family makes you more right wing, and so I suggested that just wait a month or so for academic agent to become even more right wing. So I recommend everyone keep an eye on which direction he goes on the political spectrum over the next several weeks or next few months. That should be entertaining. Can he be more right wing? We're about to find out. Okay,
maybe he'll be more socially conservative, perhaps.
Right, maybe that's what'll change, is on the social conservative angle. It'll be fun. Okay, so anyway, thanks, Mad Merc, so much. Sorry for the coordination problems this week, and we'll find a shared calendar or something and make sure we get it right next time. So, okay, Thanks, everybody. Thanks for a lot of great comments.